Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Caballero Pacamara, wash-processed Honduras from Tim Wendelboe. And there's the bag right there. And Tim Wendelboe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that needs no introduction, as they're one of the most popular coffee roasters in the entire world, and a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on multiple occasions, including earlier this year when we reviewed the Caballero Geisha. Now, the main reason for purchasing this coffee is because it does not sound like my type of coffee, and I do believe it is worth branching out and trying some coffees that might not necessarily align with your own preferences. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Tim Wendelboe's recipe, which is a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this one, Tim Wendelboe is definitely notorious for roasting on the very light side of things, and this one still holds true to the term Nordic light, as it's definitely still a very light coffee. But relative to some of the other coffees we've had from Tim in the past, and mostly because of what this coffee is, it doesn't necessarily feel quite as light as some of those other ones, but even then, it is still a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and this first try we opted for the V60, and the first thing I noticed was that it came out pretty well balanced right at the start, offering a nice level of sweetness and clarity with a slightly herbal Central American theme to it. There's a bit of this bright and slightly bitter herbality to the cup, but for the most part, a pretty nice start, a lot of what I might have expected with Tim Wendelboe given our previous experiences with his coffees. Day 17 opted for the Chemex, and the cup is actually deep as it offered a strong abundance of herbality, but in addition to that, it felt like a spiced dark chocolate at times with a slightly nutty quality as well. Not necessarily overly bright through this brew method, but rather offering a fair bit of the savory dark berry aspects to it. So it's been interesting. Two pretty different coffees from the first try, but we continue on to day 20. Opted for the April brewer, and it continues to remain on the more vibrant side of things relative to a lot of the expectations going into it, offering a slightly tart red fruit aspect and some bright acidity moderately reminiscent of Kenyan coffees. In addition to that, there's a lingering herbality that's definitely prominent and present within the cup, so that's a little bit more consistent with some earlier experiences. We continue on to day 23 through the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe. And what I noticed was that this coffee was quite robust, offering a fair bit of rich dark chocolate aspects to it and some more of those darker berry attributes reminiscent of what I would describe as heavier grapes. Moderately strong herbality, rich savoriness once again. So this was an okay day. Didn't necessarily have the best experience from this one, but coffee for the most part is starting to reach a level of consistency. We continue on to day 26. Opted for the Chemex with Tim's recipe, and this is possibly the best day of the coffee so far, as it felt a little bit more even with the slight chocolate base, more of the moderately tart berry components, and a long-lasting lingering herbality to the cup. More of the previously mentioned nuttiness as the cup starts to hit a point of consistency, something I've alluded to a little earlier, but that would continue here on day 29 as I tried one more cup with the Chemex, and it continues to remain very intense in terms of the robust herbality, the quite bright aspects at the forefront with plenty of those moderately tart berry components to it. It is complemented by more of that dark chocolate and strong herbality. The listed wine attribute makes a lot of sense because I've described this with other coffees before. It can taste like wine or have some wine-like characteristics to it without actually tasting fermenty, funky, or alcoholic. And that's kind of the case with this one. Is I can see a lot of similarities and attributes to wine in general, even if it isn't necessarily offering an alcoholic sense or component to it. Day 32. Through the V60 one more time, and the coffee is the most intense it has been, and it's actually the best it had been up to this point, as it's offering a pretty well-defined and structured cup. Right off brew, it yields a slightly bitter and smoky, lingering dark chocolate aspect that completely dominates the cup, and that is right off of brew. Once you do let it cool down, there's a lot more to it, including the herbal brightness, cooling off into a more well-rounded cup with an emphasis on the listed wine-like attributes. In addition to that, more pronounced fruits are still present at the end, bright, tart red berries, while the cup continues to feel a little bit spiced and a little bit herbal throughout. Day 35, final notes we have. The cup has settled pretty nicely as it continues to remain well defined and consistent with more of those dark chocolate forward aspects in the base, complemented by an abundance of long lasting herbality, bright red fruits, and that slightly winey quality to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. And that is the finish at a level 5. Yes, and I was honestly kind of surprised by that part of this coffee because after that sip, I know I'm going to be tasting it for a very long time, and it's that kind of dark chocolate herbal aspect to it. So it is reminiscent of some really kind of, I'll say, more cacao forward chocolates I've had in the past, and that's the kind of long lasting, lingering aspect of this one. But even then, it justifies reaching that level 5 mark because it just does continue on for a very long time. I do continue to taste this coffee for a very long time after I've consumed it. Then we have a bunch of level 4s, and we will start with the body level 4. Yes, I don't think that part will come as much of a surprise. We do have a Pacamara, we have a Central American coffee, and we have the V64. So all of those things would indicate maybe a little bit more body texture to it, and that's definitely the case with this one right here, as it offered all of those things. And that's also some previous experiences with Tim Wendelboe's coffees, is that they do tend to have a little bit more body and structure to them. Cleanliness, level 4. Yes, and I think the big thing to discuss about the cleanliness and clarity is that it does have that winey attribute to it, but I want to emphasize and really focus on the fact that it isn't necessarily like an alcoholic aspect to it. And the cup is very well structured, very well defined. Like, you can pull out a lot of these notes in notable abundance, as they do seem to have some great clarity to them. So it definitely justifies the level 4. I don't think there's any other place to really put that part. Acidity, level 4. Yes, I'm kind of surprised by how much brightness there is in this one. I feel like a lot of that was accentuated when we did increase the temperatures a bit, but that's not too surprising. Tim does tend to like some of the more bright acidic coffees in general, so level 4 for that. Spice, level 4. Yes, and I've been mentioning that it does have this kind of spiced theme to it, so like a spiced dark chocolate aspect, and it was notable and pronounced enough to the point where it scored all the way up there at that level 4 mark, alongside of the berry fruit, which scores at that level 4. And a lot of that is because this coffee did remind me a fair bit of Kenyan coffees once you got past that initial kind of more robust component to it. It did have some of those slight kind of savory berry aspects to it. So level 4 does feel apt for this. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, and this is probably the most pronounced component to it for me. It's actually reminded me a little bit of some of the El Salvadorian coffees I've had from Tim in the past, but this one specifically a little bit more on the heavier cacao, darker chocolate side of things, but it could actually justify maybe even a higher mark, but I feel like given what this coffee is, level 4, higher side of the level 4 just feels a little bit more fitting for it. And then we have a handful of level 3s, and honestly, I think we have about 3 that I think are really worth discussing. We'll start with the saltiness level 3. Yes, I'm kind of surprised by that part. I think that could do a little bit with the nutty quality that I was experiencing from it, though not always the most pronounced or abundant characteristic to it. This coffee did still seem to have a slight bit of this salty quality at times. Smokiness, level 3. Yes, and I don't want this to be confused with maybe some more of the developed characteristics you might experience from other coffees that come out a little bit more smoky. I just felt that this chocolate aspect to it was a little bit more smoky in general, but that's not necessarily to insinuate that this had a more developed quality. That's what I was kind of referencing at the start, was saying that this coffee doesn't necessarily feel as light as some other ones, but it's mostly because the flavor profile of this one did tend to lend itself towards a little bit more of a smoky quality in general. And then the last thing worth discussing is the sweetness at a level 3. Yes, I don't necessarily think that sweetness is what they were going for with this coffee. I feel like this coffee has a number of characteristics and traits that it really wanted to emphasize, but sweetness was probably not at the top of that priorities list. So I don't think it's too surprising that it reached that level 3 mark. But even then, it had perhaps a little bit more sweetness than I might have expected given the profile of this coffee. So as I'm kind of taking a look back at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's actually a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with 2 really notable compliments that I do want to give to Tim Wendelboe as well as this coffee. The first of which being that I've always respected and appreciated the fact that they go with coffees that align with their own preferences, because one of the things I've said about Tim Wendelboe in the past is their coffees aren't necessarily catering to me. Like, this seems to be the case that I experience with a lot of Tim Wendelboe's coffees, and they do tend to be on the more, we'll say, heavier bodied, herbal, savory, and bright side of things, which aren't necessarily the things that I'm always looking for in coffees. And this one was another great example of that, and this one fits really well into Tim's catalog. In addition to that, I've always said that they do an exceptional job for being a alluring coffee roaster in terms of bringing out the vibrancy of these coffees, because this coffee at no point would I ever say is dull, and I've had so many alluring roasted coffees in the past that come out a little tame, boring, and dull, but I don't think I've ever had that experience with Tim Wendelboe. Oftentimes they do have enough of a vibrancy to them that does keep me interested in the coffees for the entire duration of drinking them. Now, that being said, I don't think it'll come as a big surprise to anybody that this wasn't necessarily my type of coffee, as it didn't offer too many of the characteristics I'm looking for, the sweetness obviously being the biggest sticking point. But I think I was hoping for a little bit more of the fruit aspects that are listed on here, though I didn't necessarily experience them. The fruit components that were offered were skewing a little bit more in the direction that I don't necessarily prefer. Not a whole lot of florality, and in addition to that, not necessarily the biggest fan of those more robust Central American characteristics. So this one wasn't necessarily meant for me, but I did say that, and I knew that going into this one. So while I appreciate what this coffee is, it's not necessarily something that I would typically go for. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is your Tim Wendelboe coffee drinker, as it offers so many of those things that I've been alluding to throughout. So it does have some really nice texture, some really nice body to it. It does offer plenty of those herbal, savory aspects that you experience from so many of his coffees in the past. And in addition to that, it offers some really nice brightness that might not necessarily be something you always experience with these Honduran coffees, but all of those things kind of put together does remind me a little bit of maybe a, we'll say, slightly more earthy version of a Kenyan coffee, which in itself does have some really nice traits and merits to it. But for the most part, I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Caballero Pacamara wash processed Honduras from Tim Wendelboe. Thank you for watching.